The hound came loping down the ridge at first light, muzzle slick with dew and breath pluming in soft puffs. He was an old dog, brindled and battle-worn, with one ear torn and eyes that had seen the bitter breadth of plains and storm. His name was Sully, and he belonged to a man named Elias Cade, a man who spoke little and carried his history like a stone in the chest pocket of his coat. They'd spent the last 3 nights camped beneath a shattered cottonwood near Dead Mare Creek, where the water curled lazy and low. The wagon ruts had faded long ago, and the trail was a ghost's whisper now, known only to mule deer and those with nothing left to lose. Elias was searching for fence posts that had been washed out by spring floods, but truly he was hunting silence, the kind not broken by gunshots or the hollow call of old names. Sully barked once, sharp and urgent, and Elias' hand went to his sidearm without thinking. He stood from where he'd been boiling coffee over a dying fire, the warmth barely touching his fingers. The hound didn't bark again. He was still, tail stiff, head low to the earth like he'd scented something sacred or ruined. Elias followed. It had rained in the night. The dirt path beneath his boots gave soft and sucked at the heels, the air thick with the scent of wet sage and iron-rich soil. Sully led him past a tangle of scrub and down into the hollow where the creek's edge bent wide like a cradle. That's where he saw her. She was half sunk in the mud, her dress soaked and clinging like it had grown from her skin. One bare foot lay askew, scraped raw. Her hair was dark with water and tangled with reeds, and her face, pale and still as stone, was turned toward the slate sky. At first, Elias thought she was dead. He stepped closer, heart thrumming slow and heavy. Something ancient and wordless stirred in him, not recognition exactly, but something deeper. A knowing. His hound stood sentinel beside her, as though he'd found what he'd been meant to find all his life. Then she breathed. A shudder, faint but real. Her lips moved, though no sound came. Elias dropped to his knees in the mud beside her, the weight of his coat dragging at his shoulders, and he touched her cheek with calloused fingers. She flinched like a skittish foal, but her eyes did not open. "You're all right," he murmured, voice rough from disuse and disbelief. "You're all right now." She didn't speak, didn't wake, but her body eased under his hand, the tension gone as quick as a snowmelt in spring. He lifted her as gently as he could, her bones light as a bird's, and carried her toward the fire, Sully close behind. She had no ring, no satchel, no boots, no sign of who she was or what road had broken her. But Elias felt it in his marrow, that she belonged to something he'd lost long ago or something he had yet to find. He didn't ask the wind what brought her. The wind never answered kindly. Instead, he laid her down in the warmth of his blanket roll and set a kettle to boil. He unwrapped the last of his biscuits and placed one beside her, untouched. Her breath came shallow and soft. He watched her, not as a man watches a woman, but as a man watches a fire in the distance, wondering if it will spread or fade. The dog curled beside her without waiting to be told. Elias sat back, arms around his knees, and watched the horizon bleed with dawn. He did not know her name, but his heart already ached with it. He did not sleep. And the dog did not leave her side. By mid-morning, she stirred again, enough to turn her face into the blanket and draw a breath that sounded less like dying. Elias had kept to his tasks in the slow, measured way of a man used to being alone, mending his saddle cinch, grinding coffee with a stone, splitting kindling from a limb too green to burn right. But his eyes kept drifting back to her. The dog lay with his chin on her thigh, still as a carved thing. Sully only twitched when a fly came too near, his loyalty more a tether than any rope Elias could have tied. When she opened her eyes, it was without panic, but not without wariness, like a doe looking out from tall grass. The green in them was soft and sharp all at once, the green of moss after fire. She blinked once, twice, and tried to sit. Her arms gave way. "Easy," Elias said. He didn't move closer, just raised a hand slow in the air between them, palm out. "You've been out a while. Let yourself be." She looked at him, not startled, not trusting either, just quiet. He poured water into a tin cup and set it beside her, nudging it closer with a stick. "Ain't poisoned," he said, and felt foolish for saying it. She didn't smile, but she reached for it. Her fingers trembled. The water sloshed. She drank like someone who'd gone too long without being allowed to. Elias waited. When she'd finished, she said one word, "Cold." Her voice was hoarse, raw like she hadn't spoken in days, maybe longer. He nodded, stood, and fetched his coat. It was heavy with dust and old pine smoke, but warm. He laid it over her shoulders and turned away as she pulled it around herself. The day warmed slow, but her shivers didn't stop. Elias kept the fire fed and coaxed her to eat, though she managed only a few bites before her strength waned again. She dozed and woke in turns, each time more lucid, but the fear never left her eyes. It was the kind of fear that came from too many things lost and never reclaimed. By afternoon, she could sit upright without falling. She wrapped the coat tighter around her, sleeves hanging past her fingertips. She watched the smoke rise and said nothing for a long while. Then, sudden as the wind shifting, she spoke. "Your dog found me." Elias nodded. "He's good at finding things." She glanced at Sully, who hadn't moved, then at Elias again. "You live out here." He looked to the ridge, where the land folded into itself, where no roof broke the sky. Close enough. She didn't ask more. He was grateful. That evening, as the sky turned bruised and the fire cracked with sap, he offered her a strip of dried venison. She took it, hands steadier now, and chewed slow. Elias stared into the flames. Words came hard to him most days, but tonight they came like water through a break in the dam. "I ain't askin' your story," he said, "but I reckon you've been through something." She didn't respond at first, just watched the fire like it held the past. Then I fell. "From where?" "Far," she said, and that was all. He didn't press. He simply nodded and reached into his satchel for a second blanket. He handed it to her without a word. She took it, eyes briefly meeting his. Later, as the stars began their slow spinning above, and Sully snored with his muzzle resting on his paws, she whispered, "I had a name once." Elias looked toward her silhouette, small and still in the dark. "It's yours still," he said. She didn't answer, but in the silence that followed, something in the air shifted, less hollow, less hurt. Elias lay back on his bedroll, arms folded behind his head. He didn't sleep, not yet, not while the fire still held. Not while she was still a stranger in the dark, but not as far from home as she'd been. The next morning brought frost sharp enough to silver the brush, though the sun would melt it by mid-morning. Elias rose before it, moving through camp in that quiet, practiced way, rolling up his bedroll, checking the mule's tether, coaxing embers back to flame. When he looked over, she was already awake, sitting cross-legged beside Sully, rubbing his ears like she'd done it 1,000 times before. She cleaned her face in the creek at dawn, and though the cold had left her cheeks raw, her eyes looked clearer, less distant. She still wore his coat, sleeves rolled up now, the hem dragging in the dirt. She hadn't told him her name, but something about her belonged here now, like a leaf that had always meant to land in this exact patch of earth. He handed her a tin cup of coffee, and she nodded her thanks. They didn't talk much. Elias didn't require talk, and she didn't seem to have use for it either. But there was comfort in that silence. It filled the hours without pressing, like the hush of snow before it starts to fall. By noon, they'd packed camp. Elias didn't ask her to come along. He didn't need to. She rose when he did, handed him back his coat without meeting his eye, and followed him along the game trail with a limp that made his gut twist. Sully trotted between them like a thread holding something fragile together. They walked until the sun was overhead. Elias kept his pace easy for her, even when it set his own bones aching. She never asked to stop, never once complained. When they reached a grove of cottonwoods with a spring trickling beneath, he set down his gear and nodded. She sank into the grass like a woman who hadn't trusted the ground to hold her for a long time. That night after they'd eaten, she finally spoke. "I was running," she said. Elias looked over, quiet but listening. "There was a man," she went on, staring into the fire, "and then there was." He didn't ask what kind of man. He didn't need to. "I thought I could make it to the next town. I thought someone there might," she shook her head. "Doesn't matter now. My legs gave out. The mud just took me." Sully whined low beside her and laid his head across her knee. Elias reached for a twig and stirred the coals, eyes low. "You're safe now." No one stays safe long. He let that hang there because it was true. She curled tighter around herself, drawing the blanket high. "What about you?" she asked. "You running too?" Elias didn't answer right away. He watched the sparks rise and disappear into the dark. "Not running," he said finally, "just not going back." She nodded as if that made sense. The wind picked up that night, carrying the scent of distant fire. Maybe another homesteader clearing brush, maybe not. Neither of them said anything about it. Sometime past midnight, he woke to movement. Not sudden, not loud. Just the rustle of her shifting closer to the fire, of Sully readjusting with a grunt. Elias blinked against the stars and saw her there, only a few feet away, her arms tucked beneath her chin, hair loose across her face. She hadn't meant to get that close. She drifted in her sleep, unguarded. A part of him wanted to pull the blanket up over her shoulders to offer some small gesture of protection, but he stayed still. In the hush of those hours before dawn, Elias listened to her breathe, steady now, and felt something soften in his chest, a thing he thought had gone brittle years ago. He didn't know if she'd stay, didn't ask, but she hadn't run come morning. And neither had he. The hills turned greener as the days lengthened, and the pair moved slow through them, him with the steady gait of someone who knew every ridge and switchback, her with a halting, watchful rhythm like her shadow still flinched from behind. Elias didn't push the pace. He walked where the mule led, sometimes pointing out patches of wild onion or spots where deer had bedded down. She rarely spoke, but her silence grew softer, not afraid anymore, just worn thin. One evening they came upon an abandoned line shack tucked beneath a bluff, its roof sagging, porch half swallowed by weeds. Elias tested the boards with the heel of his boot and nodded. She'll hold a night or two. The girl, still unnamed, though in his mind she had gathered a kind of name made up of her silences, her gaze, the way she curled her fingers around her cup, stepped inside without hesitation. The dog followed close at her side, always near enough to touch. Inside, the air smelled of dust and mouse droppings, but it was dry. Elias set to clearing a space near the hearth while she found an old kettle and brought it to the creek. She returned with her hem soaked and her cheeks flushed with exertion. He lit a fire, and they sat close that night, not for warmth but for something older than that, proximity without threat. She watched the flames a long time before saying, he used to come home drunk, first with his fists, then with worse. Elias didn't interrupt. I kept telling myself I was strong enough to wait him out, that if I could just survive him, something better would come after. She paused. But it didn't, not until I ran. He nodded slowly, leaving the hardest part. She met his eyes for the first time in days. Did you? Not the same, he said, but yeah, I left something behind. She didn't ask what, that was mercy. The wind shifted through the boards and the fire flared. Elias leaned back against the wall, stretching his legs out slow. She moved her blanket closer, not touching him, but near enough that he could feel the edge of her presence. Sully thumped his tail once in the dark. When they rose the next morning, she asked, "Will you show me how to set a snare?" He raised a brow, then nodded, "Course." So he did. He showed her where the rabbits ran, how the loop should fall easy, not tight, not obvious. Her hands learned fast, thin fingers working the wire like they were remembering rather than learning. They stayed in the shack for 3 nights, and each morning she rose before him, gathering kindling, boiling water, sometimes humming soft under her breath. The tune was broken, a bit off-key, like she'd half forgotten it, but it stuck in Elias' mind long after it stopped. On the 4th day, she asked, "Do you ever go into town?" Elias didn't answer right away. "Sometimes, when I need flour or bullets." Her lips pressed tight. "I need to know if he's still looking." He understood, the kind of understanding that didn't need words. So they packed up, and he led her down to Benton's Crossing, a nothing place with 1 saloon, 2 crooked storefronts, and a post office that mostly held dust. She stayed back beneath her hat, face turned from the main road, while Elias did the asking. Folks remembered a man fitting the description she gave, mean eyes, gray coat, bad limp on his left, but he hadn't passed through in weeks. Some said he was headed north. Some said he was dead in a ditch. None could say for sure. When Elias came back with the news, she closed her eyes and let out a breath that looked like it had waited years to be let go. That night they camped by the river. She sat with her back to a cedar trunk and said, "My name's Marin." Elias nodded once. "Good name." She smiled then, the first real one, small and crooked but whole. "What about you?" "Elias Cade." She repeated it under her breath, like a word she didn't want to forget. The moon came up full and silver, casting the world in soft light. Sully snored between them, belly full, dreams twitching behind his paws. Marin reached out then, not for Elias, not yet, but for his coat, which she draped across both their legs. She said nothing else, she didn't need to. And when Elias finally closed his eyes, he dreamed of nothing, not gunsmoke, not blood, not the sound of someone leaving, but only of green hills and a hand beside his in the grass. They headed west after that, not with any fixed plan, but with the sense that something lay out there worth finding, even if it wasn't marked on any map. Elias had heard of a valley where the land still yielded good graze, where the snow came late and water ran clear most of the year. He said it offhand one morning while packing their things, and Marin had only nodded, as if she'd already known they'd be going. They passed through country where the grass grew so tall it brushed their waists, where coyotes yipped from distant hills and hawks wheeled silent above them. Marin walked straighter now. The bruises that once bloomed at her wrists had faded to shadows. Her eyes still watched the horizon too often, but some of the flinch had left her shoulders. She laughed once, sharp, surprised, when Elias fell into a prairie dog hole up to his shin. It was the kind of laugh that caught both of them off guard. Elias just grinned through the dirt and said, "Had to earn that one, huh?" They made camp early that evening near a dry creek. Elias cleaned his rifle, while Marin boiled beans with wild garlic she'd foraged herself. She had a way now of moving through the land that showed she'd been paying attention. How she turned her ear to the wind, paused before cresting a ridge, kept her boots light on loose shale. After supper, she leaned against a stone and asked him, "Did you ever want a family?" He sat quiet a moment, "Thought I had one once, lost her, long time back." Marin didn't press. "Me too," she said. "Not by death, but by disappearance, piece by piece, until I couldn't find myself in the mirror anymore." Elias watched the fire curl around the wood. "You see yourself now?" "Sometimes," she said, "then, more when I'm near you." He looked over, heart tugging low and slow. Her face was unreadable, lit only by firelight and the moon's hush. He reached for a stick, poking at the coals. "I never needed much, but I always thought maybe, someday, there'd be someone who didn't flinch when I walked into a room." Marin didn't look away. "I don't flinch, Elias." He nodded once, slow, feeling the truth of it settle between them. The next morning brought a dusting of snow across the ridges. Spring hadn't shaken winter's grip just yet. Marin woke early and wrapped herself in her blanket, sitting beside Sully while Elias saddled the mule. She looked out at the hills, brow furrowed. "There's something different out here," she said. Elias didn't speak, just handed her a tin cup of coffee and followed her gaze. They crested the final rise before midday and saw it, a valley laid out below them like a promise. Tall grass, a stream meandering like a silver ribbon, cottonwoods lining its edge. No sign of another soul. Elias stopped and breathed deep. "We could stay." Marin nodded, then turned to him, voice soft. "I don't want to be a guest anymore." He looked at her then, really looked, at the line of her jaw, the steadiness in her eyes, the way her hands didn't tremble even as the wind bit through her blanket. "You ain't," he said, "not for a while now." They pitched camp near the stream and started clearing brush the next day. Elias marked out a space for a linta, while Marin built a stone ring for the fire. It was work that made the bones ache, but it was honest. Each night they collapsed beside one another, too tired to talk, but not too tired to listen to the way their breaths moved in rhythm. On the fifth evening, Marin brought him a small bundle wrapped in cloth. His coat, stitched neat where it had torn at the hem, buttons replaced with carved bits of antler. "Found it snagged on a branch days back," she said. "Didn't feel right leaving it broken." Elias took it in both hands. "Neither did you." She didn't speak, just stepped closer and laid her forehead to his chest, right over the place where the stone he carried had begun to turn warm. He didn't move at first, then he lifted his hand and rested it at the nape of her neck. They stood there a long time, not speaking, not needing to. The dog circled twice beside them and lay down with a satisfied grunt. That night, as the fire cracked and the wind sang soft through the grass, Marin reached for Elias' hand beneath the blanket. He took it. Not as rescue, as recognition. By the time high summer came, the lean-to had grown into a cabin, rough-hewn and uneven but sturdy enough to hold against the wind. Elias had shaped the timbers himself, and Marin lined the chinks with clay and moss. The dog, grown gray at the muzzle, patrolled the edge of their clearing like he'd been born to it. Some mornings, Marin would find his print circling hers in the dew, two sets of tracks crisscrossing like a vow spoken without words. They planted potatoes in the soft earth near the stream, staked out lines for beans and squash. Marin tended them like she was learning a language written in leaves and root. Elias hunted further up the ridge, leaving before sunrise, returning at dusk with his coat smelling of pine and powder. She met him at the door each time, and the silence between them by then had changed, less guarded, more full. One evening, after a rain that left the sky the color of old pewter, Elias came back with a fawn slung over his shoulder and found Marin humming by the fire. Not the half-forgotten tune from before, a new one, her own. He set the fawn down to dress it and listened without letting on. When she noticed him, she stopped. "Didn't know I was doing it," she said, a little embarrassed. "I did," he said. "Been hummin' that one in my head for days." She smiled then, wide and open. "Must be stuck in both of us." That night, as the wind curled low through the valley, she stepped outside and stood barefoot in the wet grass. Elias followed, watching her from the porch. "It don't ache like it used to," she said, voice low. "What don't?" "My breath," she said. "My bones, me." He nodded. "Good." She turned to face him. "I didn't think I'd ever feel still again, like I wasn't always one step from running." Elias came down the steps and stood beside her. "You're still now." "I think it, 'cause I was found." She looked at him then, not the way she used to, not from the corner of her eye, not braced for loss, but full on, with the strength of someone who knew what it meant to be lost and chose not to be any more. "I didn't find you," Elias said, voice quiet. She tilted her head. "No." He glanced toward the ridge where Sully lay stretched beside the porch, his ears twitching in sleep. "He did." She followed his gaze and smiled. "But," Elias added, turning back to her, "my heart knew you before my eyes did." Marin's breath caught. The old kind, the kind she hadn't let herself feel in years. She stepped closer, pressed her palm to his chest. "I reckon mine did too." The wind rustled the cottonwoods. The cabin behind them glowed with firelight. Somewhere far off, a coyote called and an owl answered. They didn't kiss, not then. They just stood with the weight of each other close, with the wind in their clothes and the earth steady beneath their feet. It was enough. It was more than enough. And when winter came, when snow gathered at the corners of the roof and the stream slowed to a hush beneath its icy coat, the cabin held. So did they. Not because of need, not because of fear, but because two people, once lost in the dark, had chosen to stay found. Together.